Hello, I'm Dennis Magee, and before I start my reading, I would like to congratulate Graham Battison for this wonderful program. Graham's going to be my assistant director, curator of reptiles at the new reptile gardens here in Hot Springs. But it's a wonderful program, and I hope you all support it. Thank you. I'm going to read from Snakes and Snake Hunting, Carl Kaufeld's book. It was published in 1957, and it inspired me to the point where within months of finishing the book, I literally got in my car. I was 16 years old at this point, and got my twin brother. We drove straight down during the Easter vacation without our parents knowing where we really went. We were caving, supposedly. And I drove down to South Carolina and actually drove into his camp at about 3:30 in the morning as they were just unloading from the vehicles from the Staten Island Zoo. And it so happened that I was the first, this was 1958, spring of, and I was the first snake hunter to ever pull in on Carl Kauffeld in South Carolina. But we hit it off, and he was a gentleman, and took us under his wing, and we had a great trip. But I read this particular chapter, chapter 11, the Saga of Sandy Hill, and I'd like to share that with you if I can. I know it's a long one, but we'll try and break it up with some pictures or something as we go. But, and bear with me, I haven't read out loud for a long time. As the Yankee tourists hurl themselves towards Florida on National Highway 17 through southern South Carolina, just north of Savannah, they little know nor care. They are traveling through a paradise for snakes and a snake hunter's El Dorado. If snake hunting ever becomes very popular, which God forbid it should, the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce could boast another attraction of this lovely state. Chasing one another pell-mell along the highway, the strangers from the north are probably comparing the monotonous scenery with the rolling hills of New England. But these flat, sandy pine woods, relieved by occasional swamps, through which the road cuts like a gash, straight as an arrow, have a charm these folks can never know nor appreciate. Even the snake hunter, it doesn't appear to be prepossessing. Yet there is a spot hardly 100 yards from the highway, within sight and sound of the roaring traffic, where I have had a rendezvous with the Diamondback rattlers 3 years in succession. On a warm Sunday morning in early April, Harry Bennett of the Ocoee Club showed me this place for the first time. A pale sun threw just enough heat to bring out reptile life. We parked our car near the edge of the flooded field and walked around to the far side where a stand of broadleaf trees grows from the swampy ground. Prone trees, logs, and stumps are the constant preoccupation of the snake hunter in this country. And an especially interesting windfall at the edge of the woods attracted us immediately. We circled the top end of the fallen giant, and as we came towards the jutting bramble-covered root, there, stretched out on the trunk, was a big black diamondback, one of the darkest I have ever seen. He blended so beautifully with his surroundings, the crisscross pattern melting with the shadows of the sticks and vines thrown a sickly sun, that it is a wonder we ever saw him. It seemed a shame to disturb him, but I thrust my hook under him at mid-body and swung his bulk free of the tangle of thorny blackberry brambles that provided a spurious protection. At the moment he was lifted, he sounded his rattle, and as soon as he felt the ground under him again, made long lunges at us, at the same time maneuvering backward and away from us in the usual diamondback manner. Quickly I depressed the big broad head and secured a grip on the neck with my left hand. The great jaws gaped and the venom squirted from the enormous fangs as he bit impotently at the empty air. I lowered the heavy body into the sack Mr. Bennett held in readiness, and our black diamond was in the bag. A few weeks after, when this snake completed its first skin shed of the year, it was still remarkably black. This is diamondback rattlesnake country. the best I know, and I was to see many in the region in the course of the next few years. But this particular den log has special reason to live in my memory, because when I returned to it almost exactly a year later, lacking a few days, there was another big diamondback. Hardly daring to find anything there in the spring of the third year, yet half expecting, I made my way more cautiously than ever to the magical spot. Early one afternoon, when weather conditions seemed especially favorable, and my diamondback was there waiting for me. Another big one. They had all been of exceptional size. It was uncanny, the regularity which I found these snakes in the identical spot year after year, creating an illusion like one sometimes imagined through a trick of the mind of having experienced an entire incident at some time before. Only this was no illusion. There was certainly nothing illusionary about the snakes. As I retraced my steps to the car, I came upon a splendid corn snake lying partly hidden in dry leaves at the base of a stump. Two of the world's largest, most beautiful snakes, side by side in the same habitat, one among the largest and most deadly known, and the other as harmless as it is handsome. Yet such an occurrence is almost a commonplace here, and is only a small part of the story of Okatee, the Saga of Sandy Hill, the most fabulous snake country anywhere. Each spring for 6 years I have had the unmitigated joy of prowling over this enchanted land, seeking the eastern diamondback, king of the American poisonous snakes, and finding them gratifyingly abundant, more than I ever thought possible, together with a score of other species of snakes, venomous and non-venomous. I owe my good fortune largely to the staff of the Okatee Club, whose courtesy and hospitality have been in the finest tradition of the Old South. Anticipation builds up to a greater pitch each year, and every visit becomes more delightful than the last. To me, the diamondback will ever be the big game among snakes of any kind anywhere, and the sight of one in its natural haunts is one of which I never tire. One is as big a thrill as another, the last as much as the first. Having yet to fire a gun at any animal, I am glad, nevertheless, that there are people to whom shooting is sufficient reason to maintain a preserve of many thousand of acres for quail and other game birds. By developing these great tracts of coastal forests for over half a century to support the greatest number of birds, the Okatee Club has incidentally provided a set of ecological conditions almost fantastically favorable to snakes. Without too much disturbance of natural conditions, there has been a process of partial clearing, burning, and planting, resulting in a peculiar compromise between the completely wild and the cultivated. Here one can travel for miles without seeing a habitation, yet the forest is interspersed with cleared areas planted in corn. These fields are sometimes as little as a quarter acre, many are larger, but I doubt that any single one is more than an acre. This purpose, of course, is to provide forage for quail, but many other animals find it their bonanza. Rice rats, cotton rats, rabbits, a host of rodents have an undiminished food supply, and their numbers have inevitably attracted snakes. By such manipulating, man has always produced an anomalous condition, as we see here. There is hardly any question that snakes are more numerous now than they ever were in pre-Columbian times. Primeval conditions rarely favor one animal more than another. The virgin forest is often relatively sterile. Here the original timber has long since been cut, and everywhere there are huge stumps of what were once forest giants, partly burned and partly eroded. Widespread controlled burning is another aspect of the same picture. To prevent excessively dense undergrowth and grass from growing uncontrolled, each spring scattered tracts are put to the torch. I know this will strike horror to the hearts of many conservationists, but the picture is not as black as the fire-charged stumps that pockmarked the Okatee Preserve. Fire is a natural phenomenon in pine-barren country, and it is well known that many species of pine are highly resistant to fire, and some, like longleaf pine, cannot propagate where dense grass shuts off the light from the seedlings. Many insect pests and fungus diseases are destroyed by fire. It has been found in certain regions where burning has been outlawed that there were few, if any, benefits derived, that the only result was an impenetrable tangle of vegetation with second-growth timber never being able to gain a toehold in competition with fast-growing brush, vines, and grasses. And even the grasses become too high and tough for cattle to graze. One would suppose that these fires would be destructive to wildlife, particularly ground-dwelling forms like snakes, but this is not so. It seems to favor rather than discourage them, and so far as I can see, the only animals of any kind that suffer very much are turtles. Apparently, they do find it difficult, if not impossible, to escape the flames, and their charred shells are scattered about everywhere. Snakes, on the other hand, are well provided with convenient holes into which they retire when the flames make it too hot on the surface, and of the many I have seen, there has yet to be one that showed any signs of being burnt. In fact, it is especially the burned areas that are most productive for the snake hunter, and many times I have seen them abroad in a field that was reduced to ashes and still smoldering. Such fields always have innumerable scattered stumps, like small shell craters of varying size and in different stages of decay, but the eroded root systems, some of them were veritable giants, offer haven to every kind of surface life. They are the favorite retreats of small mammals and snakes, and the snake hunter soon learns that his quarry and these stump holes cannot be disassociated. Every stump could, and often does, harbor a snake. He circles stumps and peers into the holes until he sees stumps in his sleep. Stump hunting, we call it facetiously, but it is a technique which has a fascination to which nothing else compares. The number of stumps is endless, and as long as there is another stump, there can be another snake, on, one stump after another. At each one, the unformed question, what will it be? Diamondback, corn snake, king snake, canebrake. Anything is possible, yet each time something appears, it comes as a surprise. Skirmishing about in a palmetto scrub, as described earlier, has the same fascination in part, with this difference, that no palmetto scrub was ever so rich in reptile life as these stumps. There is one request that is almost imperative. There should be a cornfield nearby. This is the magic combination that makes for snakes, and on the Okatee is repeated over and over again. I don't think I ever appreciated the significance of the name corn snake so much as since I've hunted Okatee, but it would be quite as appropriate to several others that frequent cornfields and their vicinity, especially the Diamondback rattlers. On my first visit to Okatee in company with Carl Herman, we stopped at the club's office and made the acquaintance of the superintendents, Mr. N. Burton Bass and his son, Robert. Snake hunters were not new to them, but, however kind and helpful they have been, they have never quite reconciled snake hunting, as pursued by us, with complete sanity, especially the elder Mr. Bass, who has a deep-rooted dislike for all snakes. Possibly this is an understatement, but Bob is not quite so hostile and uncompromising toward snakes as his father, often bagging rattlers himself, and has always been especially willing to lend his hand and effort to hunting and spotting them. We left our newfound friends and set out to find the campsite at Sandy Hill. Never will I forget the first ride in the late afternoon of a clear spring day through the vast reaches of Okatee property, of which I was seeing only a small part. We left our newfound friends and set out to find the campsite at Sandy Hill. Never will I forget the first ride in the late afternoon of a clear spring day through the vast reaches of Okatee property, of which I was seeing only a small part. The winding sand road leaves an alley of fine live oaks, passes one or two small farms, and then penetrates into the inhabited backcountry, where it leads through a succession of flat woods, open fields, cornfields, stands of longleaf pine, slash pine, and loblolly, hickory woods, and other broadleaf trees, and the swamp of gums, oaks, and maples. After crossing the seaboard railroad tracks, the road continues through more open pine woods with scattered stumps and finally runs along a dike over a swamp and rice fields. A sharp turn to the right, and we entered a marvelous grove of monster, moss-draped live oaks, their huge, spreading limbs shutting out almost all light, their small, leathery brown leaves carpeting the ground everywhere in a thick mat. Many fallen limbs were strewn about. Some of the trees leaned and others were lying prone. Here and there splendid dogwoods lifted their flower-laden branches to the light that filtered through the limbs of the giant oaks. Barely able to follow the leaf-filled ruts of the road, we soon came to the end of our journey at a pavilion under enormous virgin loblolly pine, the biggest I'd ever seen, their huge smooth trunks reaching 100 to 120 feet into the air. Before us, to the left, spread Duck Pond. Some coots floated on its calm surface, and an anhinga, or water turkey, flew into the dark vegetation at its far border. Overhead, flying low, two American egrets winged their way to the nearby rookery. In recent years, these egrets had been gathering on a narrow bar into the pond from the near shore. In late afternoon and early evening, sometimes more than 100 of these big white birds, standing or walking about on their long black legs, come to be seen from the dike that borders the pond at the campsite on the western edge, one of the most romantic and picturesque spots I have ever seen. I felt it was worth the trip, if for nothing else than the joy of camping here for a week or 10 days. Dusk was coming on as we unloaded our duffel, quickly made camp, and prepared a hasty supper. As it grew darker, the incessant cricetations of the cricket frogs became greater in volume and frequency. The foghorn voice of the bullfrog joined in now and then with the pig-like grunts of a grillo or southern bullfrog. The two species occur together here. Southern leopard frogs gave their chunking call intermittently, and on warmer nights the green tree frogs would sound off quonking from the low bushes at the edge of the pond. The temperature now was 50 degrees and could drop to 40 by morning, but at least the unremitting winds had died with the sun, and now the stars appeared above the big domes of the pines. Bats darted in and out of the trees, and a chuck willow's widow gave its plaintive call in the distance. A big pale yellow moon silhouetted the moss-draped oaks to the east, and a great horned owl hooted a welcome from a tree not far away. We returned his greeting, imitating as best we could. Hoo, 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 I can't do that, slurring the end note in the approved fashion. Apparently the bird didn't consider it too poor, for we called back and forth in owl talk for some time, but otherwise we were silent and drew closer to our fire of fallen oak burrows, pine cones, and Spanish moss, the wonderfully romantic smoke keeping off the mosquitoes which had taken over the night shift from the punkies or the no-see-ums that were a minor pest during the day. Nothing could spoil the enchantment of the night sights, sounds, and smells. The moon, rising higher, skimmed on the lake and flooded the woods with its soft, pale light. The South Carolina moon really does seem to be a special moon, although I would never take a songwriter's word for it against the astronomers. Yet I can take issue with the folk who are convinced that flat country has no charms and can only appreciate the obvious scenic values of mountainous or rolling landscapes. With hardly an elevation of even 50 feet above sea level, the swamps and lagoons, the flat woods and hardwood hammocks have a beauty and grace all their own, every bit as satisfying as the craggy peaks or rounded ridges of the highlands. As our gaze was held enthralled by the leaping flames of the fire, our thoughts were filled with speculation on what reptilian splendors the morrow would reveal to us. Weary from the day's traveling and filled with anticipation of the next day's activities, we let the fire die and soon retired. But it was some time before the haunting night sounds and the moon-washed scene would permit sleep. I dozed fitfully, only to be awakened by the screaming and crackling of the anhinga across the lake. Something must have knocked it off its perch. The frog calls had diminished as the temperature dropped, but the horned owl continued to report on its night's hunting from various stations. Perhaps it was more than one bird, but I became too sleepy to be analytical. It was growing colder, and as I pulled the blanket closer, even the cricket frogs seemed to have been chilled into silence. Nighttime at Sandy Hill is anything but dull. At break of day, the world came alive with bird voices and activity, the cooing of mourning doves, the whistling of the cardinals, the chirp of the robins, the screams of catbirds, and the warblers and the mockers, with a host of others unidentifiable by me, all accompanied by the riveting, machine-like beat of the red-billed woodpecker on the surrounding tree trunks, made further sleep impossible. It was too early and too cold to consider looking for snakes, so we busied ourselves getting breakfast and organizing our camp better than the failed light permitted the evening before. We were visited by another friend who learned of our arrival through the Okatee grapevine. Mr. Harry Bennett, Okatee warden and crackerjack woodsman, has seldom been able to accompany us on sorties afield, but his suggestions have been invaluable and his knowledge of the surrounding country is profound. Our visits to Okatee have been the more pleasant for our contact with him. About 9 o'clock, when the temperature had risen to about 60 degrees, we set out to hunt an area northwest of camp. Carl and I have never been able to stay together while hunting, not even close, a good thing in one respect. Still, it is safer to work closer together in country such as this. I haven't expected snakes to be jumping out at us from every thicket, but they did appear rather more slowly than I thought they would, possibly because of the chill air, which warmed very slowly despite a bright sun. A snake hunter can find almost as many excuses as a fisherman for his lack of success. One factor worried me very much. That was the high wind. Wind is usually inamenable to snake hunting, but I was to learn that in South Carolina in the spring, winds are almost constant, sometimes day and night. A still day is exceptional. Knowing that snakes universally dislike wind, one must keep in mind they will only be found on the lee side and sunny side of a stump or windfall. On very cool, very windy days, they will not appear, regardless of how clear and sunny it may be. But if they were to wait for the wind to die down completely, they would never show themselves at all. We circled widely to the north and west, and quite unconsciously soon wandered out of sight or sound of one another. Carl made the first catch about 9:30, a good-sized coach-whip snake, but I searched for over an hour before I saw anything but one black racer. After reaching the seaboard tracks, I cut back to the sand road, examining all stumps carefully as I went. As I neared the road, I saw 3 mounds of sand that had been hurricanes, the name given here to windfalls dropped by winds of hurricane force. The roots and branches had long since burned and decayed, but the earth that had been lifted by the roots formed 3 mounds side by side, riddled with holes and tunnels. We cherished the 3 sisters, and I was about to make my first find here. The front, or what had been the exposed roots originally, was in the sun and out of the wind, and lying near one of the many holes was a medium-sized diamondback. He must have recently shed his skin, for he was quite brilliant. Apparently, he hadn't had time to warm up much, for he permitted himself to be pinned and picked up without too much fight. I was delighted with this diamondback, caught in the first hour of serious hunting. It seems to me this must really be Rattlesnake Haven. I never saw another diamondback at the 3 Sisters, but became a regular port of call, and each year something turns up here. The very next year I found a mating pair of hognose snakes, fairly rare snakes hereabouts, and Carl found a fine corn snake the year after that. The hognoses were extremely black with no trace of pattern, a condition which seems to be the mode among hognoses of this region. They are famous everywhere for their antics when first approached, usually huffing and puffing in a menacing manner, all of which is bluff, and if this is ignored and they are touched or picked up, they will feign death by rolling over on their backs, relaxing completely, parting the mouth, and letting the tongue loll out in a most convincing demonstration. It was rather amusing to watch the difficulties these 2 snakes had, being joined in copulation, in rolling over on their backs, but naturally they disengaged quite properly, although not immediately, and proceeded to go into their song and dance. The larger snake, the female, was about 2 feet long, and like all their kind, both snakes were heavy-bodied. The black coloration of the hognoses locally is the more remarkable for being near regions where the most colorful individuals of this species occur. Widely distributed over the eastern United States, they show amazing variety and range of colors and intensity of pattern. The most colorful I have seen come from Louisiana. They are frog and toad eaters, especially the latter, and it is usually difficult, if not impossible, to get them to feed on anything but toads. Undoubtedly, the turned-up snout, which has given them their popular name, serves as a trowel to dig their food out of sandy burrows. The western hognose snake is remarkable in my experience in that it will sometimes accept mice. I have known 2 such, and both snakes were maintained for a number of years on a diet of nothing but mice. But the eastern species never seems to deviate from its diet of amphibians. We returned to camp, intending to explore the area to the south and west of Duck Pond, but before leaving again, we were distracted by the tempting live oaks which could harbor yellow rat snakes. Closer scrutiny of the magnificent trees showed them to be alive with many kinds of life, but skinks and anolas were among the numerous. Clambering up strands of Spanish moss, the anolas would stop and peer at us, cocking one eye independently of the other, and fan out the throat to show the dilated pink skin between the scales, possibly because they were in the sun and active. I don't remember seeing any but green ones, although they also changed to different shades of brown. On the trees nearest to our camp, on the lowest branch, the lowest limb, about 20 feet up, Carl discerned the overlapping portion of a rat snake's elliptical coil. We debated how we could best secure this animal and quickly reached a decision. I found a long, sturdy limb among the dead wood on the ground, long enough and with sufficient curve to reach across the limb. Carl placed himself underneath in readiness as I aligned the end of my pole and gave the snake a shove that caught it off balance, one might say, and pushed it off the other side. Carl caught it dutifully as it came hurling down. The whole operation had been so sudden that the snake had only partly uncoiled by the time it reached his hands. These are sometimes called live oak snakes, and this one had the typical olive drab ground color with 4 narrow brown stripes running down the back and either side. All the 4-line rat snakes here are quite dark, not nearly so yellow as further south. Despite the unabated wind, this first day was remarkably productive. We succeeded in catching a large red-headed skink that made its home in the hollow trunk of an oak that retained a hold on an embankment overhanging the path down to the dike within a few feet of camp. Some days later, Carl caught a lovely corn snake that seemed also to live in this same hollow tree. But this day I found a small cottonmouth lying in the path along the dike, and Carl found a beautiful keeled green snake at the far side of the pond. Later in the afternoon, I came upon a king snake in a stump hole on the other side of the railroad tracks. Still later, we drove to a few miles down the state road to a general store to buy some necessary provisions, and on our return, stopped off at a site near the road where there had once been a cabin standing between 2 cornfields. Nothing remained now except some rubble in the form of rusted pieces of corrugated roofing and odds pieces of metal. These were to prove one of our most reliable hunting grounds. Offering shelter from the wind and heated by the sun, this metal was quite tempting to snakes. The temperature in the shade hadn't risen above 72 degrees all day, and now, as the sun was sinking in the west, the warmth was especially attractive. I uncovered a racer first, and then, turning the biggest piece of roofing at the main load, we found a large, handsome corn snake. It measured exactly 5 feet and is still living, although apparently hasn't grown an inch in 5 years. Of the dozens I have seen and caught, I have never seen one as large, although there is one isolated record of a corn snake just exceeding 6 feet. On the Okatee, corn snakes are among the most numerous snake, and they grow to greater size and greater beauty than I have known from elsewhere. The range of variation in color, intensity, and pattern over an area of at most 10 square miles is quite amazing. Some have a ground color of mouse gray with dark scarlet blotches. Others, the prettiest, have a rich orange ground color with vermilion blotches. It is odd that the lighter colored snakes usually have fewer body blotches, and there is no sexual correlation so far as I can tell. In my estimation, the corn snake is not only the most beautiful, non-poisonous snake in the United States, but in the world as a whole. Although we caught 8 snakes on that first day of 8 kinds, a greater variety than I anticipated. Under the 10 at the burned cabin, we were to find in the course of the next 3 seasons 3 corn snakes, 1 coach whip, 2 black snakes found in company with the coach whip, 2 garter snakes, and 1 baby diamondback, all under or 2 pieces of metal at one time or another. A remarkable assemblage, considering what an prepossessing spot this appears to be on first acquaintance, but it is often difficult to understand what has appeal for snakes. The first and the last catch of each trip always seem to stand out in one's memory, but more than that, certain areas give special cause to be remembered. Thus, I have a soft spot for a field northwest of Sandy Hill, perhaps 2 acres in area, that has produced more fine snakes per square foot than any other. Slightly more elevated than the surrounding terrain, it is planted with 2 or 3 corn patches of no more than 6 or 8 rows each, at right angles to one another, and separated by a low, scrubby growth and untilled fields, with the usual scattered stumps. At its western edge, it drops off to a swamp of mixed hardwoods and cypress, and although there is nothing especially distinctive about it, one feels intuitively that snakes must be here. The stump fields had been burned 2 or 3 days before Carl and I first went there, and almost immediately we came upon a diamondback of considerable size, and 2 or 3 stumps away, a 4-foot canebrake rattler. I often wondered whether these 2 snakes occurred close together in the same habitat, and here they were, almost side by side. Although the canebrake was on high, dry ground, the invariable choice of diamondbacks, the proximity of the swamp was consistent with the preferences of the giant southern lowland form of the timber rattlesnake. The stumps on which we found these snakes were of the kind most frequently favored, broad, crater-like, with spreading roots, the center burned and decayed, with a deep hollow and only the low circular rim of the tree's base remaining. Within this shell there are always galleries of openings into the root tunnels, probably enlarged and extended by the activities of all kinds of small animals. As I understand it, snakes are attracted here first by the presence of food, and finding the burrows of their former meal convenient as temporary homes, they remain until hunger drives them forth to seek food again. As the mild southern winter sets in, they stay at the burrow they happen to be in when the cold weather first approaches, emerging briefly during the winter months when mild days make it possible. There is no general exodus or mass activity until spring has arrived, usually late March and early April, a time corresponding to similar breakings of hibernation in snake dens in the north in late April and early May. The South Carolina spring is at least a month to a month and a half earlier than in Pennsylvania and New York. This same field yielded a fine, big yellow rat snake, living in a stump hole like the rattlers, and just across the sand road, cutting down to the swamp, a beautiful corn snake. In other years, we could always depend on finding something here. On Good Friday afternoon of 1953, I found a big diamondback at a stump on surprisingly low ground near the swamp, one I would have thought more likely to harbor a canebrake rattler. The big southern cousin of the timber rattlesnake is distinctly a snake of swamp edges, unlike the rock-loving highland form we know in New York, but it is rarely found in wet spots. The stumps lying in flooded fields are shunned just as much by the canebrake as they are by the other snakes. I mentioned elsewhere that elevation is relative. This is clearly demonstrated in the South Carolina lowlands when the countryside is flooded by the rains of late winter and spring. The higher ridges, as they are called locally, are the unflooded portions. Here the stump holes will be water-free and potential homes for snakes. It is true that moisture-loving king snakes and cottonmouths are most likely to be found on the wet transitional slopes between the high dry and the low wet. Occasionally, When the rainfall has been especially heavy, snakes will be washed out on some of the higher ground, demonstrated by a corn snake I once found sitting on top of a stump, marooned by the surrounding water. But their selection of the dry holes is usually unerring, and one wonders how they know they are making the proper choice at a time when they are all dry, as they are in the autumn before hibernation. In hunting the stumps, a doubtful hole is tested by running the handle of the snake hook into it to see whether there is water near the top. If it comes out wet, it is futile to seek further, since this indicates that the level of water in the entire area, allowing for capillary and higher ground, must be sought. The hunter soon learns to recognize sign. A hole occupied by mice and rats usually will not have any snakes. They haven't arrived yet to clean it out. But where the entrance is packed and smooth or showing definite tracks, very likely it is currently lived in. Sometimes by stepping back to gain the proper angle for a view in, the occupant can be seen as he lies just back from the opening. If it is a diamondback or other rattler, the angle of the hook is slipped in under or over a coil, and then with a twist and a yank, the snake is scooped out into the open, like shucking an oyster out of its shell. Such surprise tactics are almost always successful, but care must be taken not to alarm the snake into retreating down into the burrow. Stepping about softly so as not to cause undue vibration of the ground is absolutely essential, just as essential here as it was in the boulder dens in the mountains described earlier. Yet there are times when a surprising amount of disturbance will still not cause a snake to withdraw. So it was that hunting over the field south of camp, I once came upon a freshly shed skin of a diamondback lying in the middle of a large stump. Not being as wise as I thought, I tried to deduce the hole into which the snake had crawled by the direction of the cast skin was lying. Because the skin slips off inside out, the tail end would theoretically point the proper way. I could see nothing in the hole, but because I feared the snake might leave, if it were indeed there, I remained to keep watch and wait for Carl to come within hollering distance. Finally he did appear, and I called him over. Explaining the situation, I asked him to return to camp for a spade while I kept my vigil. Nothing occurred while he was gone, and when he brought the spade, I dug to a considerable depth without finding anything. I had just concluded that the snake must have left before I arrived, when Carl said, "Here it is, in this hole here." Sure enough, there he was, lying a few inches back at the mouth of a hole tunnel to the left of one of where I had been digging. I thought I was so clever in deducing the right one, but I'd only caused a lot of unnecessary work by permitting the cast skin to distract me from looking into the other openings. Why the snake didn't pull down out of sight is a mystery. Perhaps he was too fascinated by the foolish antics of the snake hunter at his doorstep. In any event, we hooked him out without difficulty and proceeded to catch him, and by a new method we had evolved, the two-hook technique. Once a rattlesnake has been lifted out into the open, the hunter can take his time about catching it, so long as access to escape is blocked. The diamondback always postures dramatically, with the head and the foreportion of the body raised high and drawn back in an S curve from which it lashes out at the intruder. Just as invariably, they will maneuver backward and away from the source of their fear and annoyance, but their attention remains riveted to the front as long as there is any moving object from which to retreat. The hunter throws a bag on the ground behind the snake with the open end towards him, and while controlling the snake with one hook, he reaches over and holds it open with the other. By judicious pushing and prodding, he can guide its backward course into the mouth of the sack. Any bystanders must freeze into immobility, otherwise the snake's attention will be diverted and it will track away from it. Once it starts into the sack, it can be pushed and the cloth pulled with the hooks to hasten its entry. When they sense the seeming security and partial darkness, they usually draw in to the very bottom of their own accord. Sometimes they bite at it, leaving great drops of expended yellow venom dripping from the material, and sometimes they bite through it quite viciously when they detect movement outside in their vicinity. It must be remembered they are thoroughly frightened and aroused, and for this reason the hunter takes great care to keep his hands away from the bag. Placing a hook handle flat across the opening, he pushes the snake well to the bottom, twists the free end shut, and ties it in a simple knot. Before removing the hook handle, I attach a shower curtain clamp under the knot so that it can be suspended from a snake hook and carried well away from the legs and body. This procedure is not so simple as it sounds and sometimes takes considerable time to accomplish, but patience will eventually win out. Sooner or later, the snake will back in. Noticing that one of the principal difficulties exists in trying to hold the mouth of the bag open, I have carried safety pins with which I first fasten the edge of the material to the hook by passing the pin through one of the holes in the metal, originally intended for the bolts which held the blade of the grass slicer from which these hooks are converted. I have also adapted a collapsible butterfly frame to be bolted to a snake hook. This is very efficient, but the net frame is an awkward object to carry in the field. With care and patience, all that is ever needed to catch a diamondback, untouched by human hands, is 2 hooks and a sack. Sometimes a nearby bush can be employed to hang the bag on, and the snake can be lifted into it with the hooks, but often this procedure is impossible for lack of a bush and will present other problems even greater than working flat on the ground. The reader may wonder why we go to all this trouble. Why not just pin and seize the snake behind the head? Although even the biggest diamondback can be caught in this way, it is well not to handle it if it can be avoided. There is, of course, the hazard to the hunter in catching so large and dangerous an animal, but aside from that, the main consideration is for the snake. The process of being pinned down and held, with the ensuing struggle to restrain the convulsive twisting of the heavy body, is a serious shock to the nervous system of the snake and often reflects itself in bad health later, with an even greater inability to adjust to captivity. I consider the eastern diamondback one of the most delicate and most difficult snakes to keep in captivity. Any means of reducing the shock of capture should be employed wherever possible. It so happens that a large number of the snakes we encounter on these spring hunts in South Carolina are opaque. That is, they are in the condition preceding shedding of the old skin, when the new epidermal layer is forming underneath. It is impossible to catch a rattler with the hands at this time without breaking the old skin permanently, prematurely, causing a serious abrasion which can doom the snake to an early death. Incidentally, every time a rattlesnake sheds its skin, it acquires a new segment at the base of the rattle. The famous rattle of the rattlesnake will ever be one of nature's marvels at seeming incongruously in animals that are normally very silent. This mechanically perfect noisemaker seems like something produced by man's inventive mind. It consists of a series of horny, loosely interlocking links that grow like a fingernail, but have interlocking growths synchronized with skin shedding. This stop-and-go growth results in each segment of the rattle being complete in itself but incapable of producing sound unless clicking against an adjoining segment. The rattle segments are incremented from the base of the end of the tail, where a living matrix produces a new one each time the snake forms a new epidermis. At shedding, the skin breaks off at the former basal segment, leaving it free and exposes the new segment. The sound is produced by the links clicking against one another when the snake vibrates its tail violently, after the custom of many rattleless snakes, and an expression of fear and anger, not a warning. Its service in that direction is strictly incidental and accidental. To offset my disgrace in failing to look in the right place for the snake in the previous incident, I may be forgiven for relating an exploit in which I take some pride. At still another point north of camp, Carl and I explored an entirely new area, a field hidden by woods by young oaks and maples growing from rather moist ground. There had been some burning, but although most of the grass was consumed in the flames, much of the low growth remained unscathed. Fall foliage still adhered to many branches, and the ground around the stumps was carpeted with colorful leaves. There were even more stumps than usual, and for once we worked close together, one taking one side and the other, the left. Certainly there were enough to keep two men occupied for a time. While we were weaving between and around each stump, it seems we must find something, yet nothing turned up. Then, just after crossing a shallow drainage ditch, I came upon a blueberry bush growing out of a mass of fallen leaves covering an old tree root, almost completely buried, but with one opening. I started to walk on when something seemed to click in my eyes like a camera shutter opening and closing. No, it was not an optical illusion, but it did take a moment to convince myself that I really saw a section of Diamondback hide pressed against and closing off completely the opening to the root hole, so that it didn't appear to be a hole at all. In addition, surrounding twigs and fallen leaves from the blueberry bush blended in so perfectly with the crisscross pattern of the snake that it was nearly indiscriminable and completely concealed. Possibly 8 or 9 square inches of snake were exposed to view, but they melted into the picture, both in color and texture. I was feeling rather proud of myself, and standing exactly where I first made the discovery, I called Carl over to me and asked, "Where is the Diamondback in this picture?" I have great respect for his ability as a spotter, and I do not think it distracts one bit from his prowess that he was unable to see that snake until I pointed it out to him. There must have been an extremely lucky combination of light and angle to reveal it so quickly to me. When we hauled the snake out of its marvelously camouflaged cell, we saw it had a remarkable amount of yellow in its pattern, a condition contributing much to its disguise. I have seldom seen so yellow a diamondback, and never another in Okatee. Of the 280 snakes we brought back from Okatee, caught in 74 hours of actual hunting over a period of 6 years, 60 were diamondback rattlers. This is the greatest number of any one snake in our catch. But of the 23 different kinds represented, black snakes and king snakes were the most plentiful. It is true there were some rattlesnakes that escaped us, but the king snakes and racers we passed up would easily double the number. Corn snakes run a close fourth, with 31 actually caught and possibly another 8 or 10 that we could not catch. At certain times of the year, water snakes of several species and cottonmouth moccasins can be found in fabulous numbers, but at the time of year we hunt Okatee, water snakes are a rarity. Aquatic forms generally are not well represented in our catch because we do not seek them particularly, hence 1 or 2 black swamp snakes and some number of mud snakes, all found around Duck Pond, are the only ones of that kind we saw. Among the most abundant in some areas are the ribbon snakes and southern ring-necked snakes, but because they are unsatisfactory for zoo collections, we seldom trouble to catch them. Judging by the number we saw, the scarcest of all are the scarlet king snake, the southern ground snake, the pine snake, and of all things, decay snake. One of each of the last 3 were all we found. The coral snake seems to be absent from this region, but it is fairly numerous in sections not too distant from Okatee. It is granted that our hunting is concentrated on rattlesnakes, but our procedure is such that all snakes, except for the aquatic species, would be found, and the picture of relative abundance should be fairly accurate. Not nearly so numerous as the diamondback, the canebrake rattler, with an incident of 1 in 4 rattlesnakes of the 2 species, it is much sought after. Many hunters consider them more handsome and more desirable than the diamondback. They are splendid creatures, and because of their relative scarcity, are more of a challenge to find. Early one morning, Bobby Bass in the club Jeep and Mr. Bennett in his pickup truck descended on our camp with the news that Ellis, a colored farmer who lived near southeast of Sandy Hill, had located a rattlesnake for us. We all climbed into the Jeep and headed across the dike and into the backfield where a nearly indiscriminable track led to Ellis's cabin. After Ellis joined the party, he directed Bobby to a point at the western end of the field near the railroad, and we drove to the vicinity in which he had seen the snake. Ellis, moving about very gingerly, stopped at one crater-like hole, peered into an opening, and announced quietly that this was it and the snake was at home. No particular kind of rattlesnake had been mentioned, but I had taken for granted it would be a diamondback. However, to our great satisfaction, it turned out to be an elegant canebrake rattler, a lovely snake with a rich red-brown band down the middle of the back and a sooty black chevrons standing out strongly on the pinkish-beige ground color. After catching the snake, we took Ellis back to his home, and Harry Bennett and Bobby Bass went about their various duties while we resumed the activities planned for the day. But there is an amusing sequel to the story. During the course of the morning, I decided to take time to drive to the general store down on the state road to buy some things necessary for camp. The proprietor told me that a man had a rattlesnake spotted for us and gave me quite explicit directions for reaching his home. Always willing to investigate any leads like this, I threw my purchases into the car and hurried back to the intersection of a woods road where this man lived. The area was badly flooded, so rather than risk having the car bogged down, I grabbed a snake bag and a couple of hooks and set out on foot. I sloshed through water over most of a half-mile stretch and finally came upon a cabin which looks strangely familiar. When I reached the person standing in a nearby field, it turned out to be Ellis. Then I saw what had happened. The Okatee grapevine had worked two ways. It had worked faster from the far end, and we had already caught the snake I had been told at the general store was waiting for me. The misunderstanding arose through my not knowing that Ellis's last name was Rice, having heard him referred to as Ellis and only Ellis. But Mr. Ripley at the general store had said the man's name was Rice. To complete the confusion, I approached Ellis Rice's home from the state road instead of from Sandy Hill as we had done earlier. 2 years later, another incident concerned with a canebrake rattler was not at all funny. In fact, it was tragic. Although there are some people with a perverted sense of humor who might consider it amusing. Because there had been unusual cold, with temperatures dropping to below freezing for several mornings in succession, and because serious drought the year before had left the countryside drier than I'd ever known it, our hunting had not been very productive. There had been several snakeless days, an unusual circumstance in Okatee. Charlie Hackenbrock was with me for the first time in South Carolina, and believing it advisable to explore separate areas in order to include more territory, I was hunting solo in the field mentioned earlier where a diamondback and a canebrake were found almost side by side. For once, there was little or no wind, and the sun shone warmly, and every prospect was favorable. On the highest ground, I surprised a corn snake lying out on a stump, and soon after another, a magnificent creature with just one loop of the body lying out of its hole. A patch of sunlight shone down into the crater of the stump that was its home. Vermilion saddles on a orange ground color contrasted beautifully with the charred black rootstock. 2 fine corn snakes within an hour is by no means bad, and I was feeling rather pleased as I worked down the edge of the swamp. I knew the individual stumps here almost as well as the fingers on my hand. The last one was a few yards from the sand road, and as I came upon it, I saw the rear end of a large canebrake rattlesnake vanish down a hole. I could have reached down and jerked it out suddenly with my hand, but although there would have been no danger of being bitten by this snake, one can never know what other snake might strike out from another hole. It is much better not to take such a chance. So far as I could tell, the rattler had gone quite deep, entirely out of sight, and I had no means of recovering it. Charlie had the car and all our digging equipment. I marked the spot and the hole in my memory and began the track back to camp. It was a wonderfully fine day with zebra and polyans, swallowtail butterflies floating about in the unusual soft air. I reached the twilight shade of our live oak park, and soon I was at camp making myself a sandwich while I awaited Charlie's return. Just as I finished writing him a note before striking back to the canebrake field, he finally drove in and was all in favor of digging the snake out immediately. We went back forthwith, and first clearing the obstructing shrubbery growth around the stump with a machete, we chose a point about 2 feet back from the opening of the hole and began to dig. But we seemed to strike some exceptionally tough root stems and could barely break ground, for the spade refused to penetrate more than an inch or so beneath the surface. Then, with a sinking sensation, we both saw the reason. A small patch of snakeskin showed immediately under the edge of the spade. We had been cutting into the rattler's back. The tunnel in which it lay ran unbelievably close to the surface. I could have scratched through it with my snake hook earlier without troubling to use a spade. It was a simple matter now to extract the whole snake, but the damage was done. We had unwittingly killed a prize catch. What could be more tragic? The only fortunate aspect was that we shared the blame equally. Charlie and I never can be consoled for this tragic incident, but we learned a bitter lesson. Never take for granted that such root tunnels necessarily slant down from the opening. Until Carl Herman and I explored the section of the Savannah River swamp where I found the big moccasin that had eaten the canebrake rattler, we had never discovered any spot where canebrakes and southern copperheads could be hunted specifically with reasonable assurance of success. Heretofore, they had always appeared sporadically and unexpectedly, with seldom more than 1 or 2 in the entire bag. But after Mr. Manning and Mr. Floyd, also rangers for the Okatee Club, showed us this area, we secured better representations of these 2 snakes. Both species are clearly associated in the swamp edge habitat. The region in question lies at the far western side of the Okatee property, at least 12 miles from Sandy Hill and Duck Pond. From the nearest point that can be approached by car, it is necessary to walk into the forest edge of the swamp by skirting a large cultivated field or crossing a field of stumps. Both routes have advantages. Twice I have found corn snakes. Black snakes are plentiful, and once we found a sickly 4-line rat snake that might well have been destroyed to prevent contamination of the rest of the snake population. Wednesday, March 25, 1953, was truly a red-letter day for me. It dawned clear and cool with the temperature 55 degrees at 7 o'clock. There had been thunder, lightning, and some rain the night before, but a strong west wind was blowing now, and the weather promised to be fair for the rest of that day. We reached the swamp about 9. Nothing would be stirring earlier. Across the fields, the tall trees, gums, willow, oaks, maples, changing to cypress and tupelo further in, marked the beginning of the forest that stretched another 5 miles to the banks of the Savannah. This was our objective. Almost immediately after entering the open woods, one comes upon an ancient, overgrown rail bed, the rails long since removed, but with rotting ties more or less sunken in the ground. This marks the path taken by the lumber companies years ago in transporting timber to the mills in Savannah, 35 miles away. From the field where we came in, pine slabs have been laid at some time to enable trucks to cross the old rail bed. Turning these carefully has yielded king snakes, copperheads, ringneck snakes, and dozens of skinks. The ties, too, are worth lifting where they are sufficiently loose, for we have found much interesting life under them, from marbled salamanders to king snakes. The morning and early afternoon sun shines in where the ground slopes off gradually to the fringe of the swamp, and the tall trees with the forest reaches behind them shut off the west and northwest winds. A sheltered, sunny spot of fairly open woods with numerous windfalls and patches of dense vegetation where snakes can find abundant food, water, and hiding places. This morning, as we entered the woods from the windswept cornfield, a covey of 8 or 10 quail took off almost under our feet with such a whirling of wings as to startle the wits out of us. And immediately after, we saw a huge bird flashing black, white, and red colors as it dipped low and then darted through the trees. It was a pileated woodpecker, always an impressive sight. Carl became lost to me even sooner than usual, but knowing his lone wolf preferences, I gave it no further thought. There are stump holes here, such as we have in the open fields, but huge hurricanes and hollow trees are the snake sanctuaries. I divided my search between the fallen timber at the water's edge and the more favorable spots on the high ground. Very soon I was rewarded by coming upon 2 copperheads lying together close to the water under a fallen tree. It has been remarked elsewhere that the southern copperheads of the lowlands are lighter, averagingly larger snakes than their northern cousins. These were quite typical, their coloration having a pinkish suffusion which is very characteristic. I lifted one away from the other and pinned and caught it without disturbing its mate. Dropping it in a bag quickly, I didn't give the second snake time to make up its mind to escape. When I had it securely in my hands, I took a moment to admire the chiseled lines of its head and marveled again at the fine, hollow, needle-like fangs raised now on the erectile bone which support them, and ready to give a hypodermic injection from the venom sacs at the back of the head, the same apparatus in principle which the medical profession uses to such good advantage and which was copied from the poisonous snakes. This copperhead joined his companion in the same sack, and I resumed my hunting, congratulating myself on having made so good a find so early. I searched more carefully than ever, even defying the tangled sumac which grew everywhere, and especially on the moist ground near the water. Here and there, beautiful orchid-hued zebra lilies, one flower to a stalk, grew leafless singly and incongruously from the barest ground. They appeared as if some child had stuck them about haphazardly. Perhaps a quarter of a mile beyond where I had found the copperheads, my attention was drawn to a thicket on the higher ground, quite near the old rail bed. The sun filtered through the trees onto the sumac-covered bushes that grew from around the barely discernible log decomposing at the center of the clump. I circled it slowly, trying to see what might be hidden in the tangle, and as I came around on the far side, there, stretched in a patch of sunlight, faintly undulating, was an enormous canebrake rattler. What a glorious sight! What a magnificent beast! With head raised, it looked at me and flicked its tongue, but moved not a muscle otherwise. This was a true monarch of the swamp, in a setting which made such a picture as to give me exquisite pleasure. I do not know how long I stood motionless, drinking in every detail to impress it indelibly on my memory. No camera can capture scenes such as this. I like my memory pictures much better. This massive creature was over 5 feet long, as, as was shown later, yet gave the impression of great bulk. The body was easily 14 or 15 inches around the middle. The head of the canebrake is proportionately smaller than the diamondback, but this one was at least 2.5 inches across. Looking at this snake, I could appreciate why many consider the canebrake handsomer than the diamondback. The lamp-black chevrons on ground of pinkish brown, the wide band running the length of the back, the yellowish head, and the soot-black tail all combine to give this snake a pattern and coloration which rivals even the most beautiful of other species. I was half reluctant to catch the snake, knowing it was almost certain that he would have to be pinned. The canebrake, like its cousin, the timber rattlesnake, rarely throws itself into a defensive coil like the diamondback and never maneuvers frantically with the threatening lunges at the source of annoyance, but contents itself with outright flight. For this reason, the technique of backing him into a bag was doomed to failure, but I tried it nevertheless. Lifting the snake clear of the sumac, I laid it on the ground again, but immediately it started to crawl away, and I could not direct it into the bag which I held open invitingly. Finally, in desperation, I pinned down the beautiful head, secured a grip on the neck with my right hand, and seized the snake body as quickly as possible to prevent any twisting that might break the neck. As I knelt and grasped the snake, the tail switched about, and I received a charge of musk from the scent glands full in my eyes and face. But I know from past experience, mildly startled as this may be, it is quite harmless and is less irritating to the eyes than water. With great difficulty, I managed to guide the struggling body, tail first, into the sack as it lay on the ground, and with infinite relief, I released the head and twisted shut the top of the bag, quite confident that the whole operation had been accomplished quickly enough to prevent injury to the snake. Leaving my prize in the shade, in the ditch alongside the rail bed, where I couldn't possibly overlook it on my return, I gathered up my tools and set out again to see what else I could find. I was redolent of rattlesnake musk, but no roses ever smelled sweeter. By now it was only about 10:30, and already the day was a success. What with 2 copperheads and an especially large canebrake, but most important to me was the picture of that snake lying at the door of its bramble-covered home. Not far beyond, where the shoreline of the swamp curves close in to the abandoned tramway, there was a big log that should be a tempting location for snakes. The thought had hardly crossed my mind when I saw another big canebrake lying along its side. Luck was surely with me this morning. This one was not so large or fine as the other, but a splendid snake nevertheless. The whole situation reminded me very strongly of my friends of years ago at the Den Log in Mount Misery. Certainly the Pine Barrens rattler has much in common with the canebrake. This day turned out to be almost fabulous, for besides the snakes I caught in the morning, Carl came back with 2 black racers and a copperhead. In the early afternoon, along the old rail bed, we came upon a diamondback just retreating into a stump hole, the first and only rattler of its kind we ever saw here, and a small king snake was uncovered under a tie. But then the wind became more chill, and the temperature started to drop, and we returned to camp more than satisfied with the day's catch. That this was really the home of the canebrake rattler, and its neighbor, the copperhead, was proved over and over again. The following year, with Roy Penny and Bill Somerville, we've revisited the magic spot on the third day, and Bill, now on his very first snake hunt, covered himself with glory by some spectacular spotting. First he located 2 copperheads, and then a canebrake rattler, all of them coiled in holes in windfalls where they were incredibly difficult to see. That same morning we found a copperhead under the pine slabs, and I came upon a canebrake later, coiled outside the hollow base of a living tree. Quite an unusual situation. In that same season, on first coming into the woods from the open field one morning, I walked right up to a canebrake coiled near a huge log. After capturing and bagging it, I stepped across the log and saw 2 copperheads lying together on the other side. Such finds were no longer a novelty, but the thrill does not diminish, and it never will for me. However, it remained for me to show Bill his first Diamondback. On the morning we arrived at Sandy Hill, while I was catching up on some necessary sleep, Roy and Bill, to whom the area was completely strange, reconnoitered the vicinity of the camp. Bill found a large yellow rat snake crawling along a broken branch of the same live oak from a limb of which Carl and I had knocked off a snake of the same kind some years before. A good-sized king snake and a delicate keeled green snake became his second and third snakes. Spectacular success for a novice. As an important part of his education, I wanted especially for Bill to see a diamondback in its natural haunts. So on the next afternoon, we 3 set out for the old reliable backfield, the area near camp that has yielded so many spectacular things. We spread out in a skirmish line, remaining within easy calling distance of one another. I skirted a small cornfield on fairly high ground and headed towards a tall hickory tree that leaned, what I call a half hurricane, a tree that has been partially uprooted and tipped but has not toppled. The crevice thus formed under the roots makes a very tempting shelter for all kinds of animals, and no snake hunter could ever neglect to inspect these carefully. Whether or not I have developed some sixth sense that tells me beforehand when I am about to discover a snake, I do not know, but on this occasion, as on several others, I had a feeling, almost like the ringing of a bell, that there was a snake here. I approached very slowly and cautiously, somewhat to the side to remain out of view of whatever might be lurking there, then dropped to my hands and knees and peered between the roots that still retained a terminal grip on the soil and formed a network of bars across the opening. Just visible within, coiled far back and to the right, was a huge diamondback. With great glee, I called Bill and Roy over. I was anxious for them to see this creature as I had found it, and before it was disturbed. It was necessary to break away some of the roots that covered the front of the opening before attempting to pull out the snake, which I did by tearing them up with my hook. Once a clear passage was assured, I reached in with the hook and yanked him out into the open. I doubt whether there was a hole in back into which the rattler could have retreated, but it is best not to assume that there is no such escape route. It was a huge male, opaque and blue-eyed, and care had to be taken not to rupture the skin. Here the two-hook technique was distinctly in our favor, and although it did take some patience, we succeeded in backing the brute into the sack. Bill's lesson in spotting and catching had been complete in each step from beginning to end. The details attending the capture of every snake differ, but such accounts inevitably become boring, However, I hope I may be forgiven for including one or two incidents that occurred in 1955 when Pat Bilks and his wife Bess came up from their home in Florida to join Charlie and me in South Carolina. It had been 15 years since Pat and I were in the field, and to be together again in Diamondback country seemed like rolling back the curtain of time to that memorable day almost 20 years earlier when we caught our first Diamondback in Okeechobee. Happily, during their stay, the Belkses were part of a safari organized by the Basses for our benefit, in which 5 men on horses, 3 on foot, and 2 in jeeps swept across a vast area between the Southern Railroad tracks and the Atlantic coastline tracks, an expedition which netted 6 diamondbacks and 1 cottonmouth. But more important to me were the moments we hunted alone during the 4 short days they were with us. One morning, on our way to the Savannah River swamp, we stopped briefly on the woods road near a point where a huge rattler had been found 2 days before in the course of the 10-day skirmish with the explorers. 3 small bridges crossed a narrow swamp here, and Charlie and the Bilkses looked about cautiously while I, for some reason still can't quite explain, felt impelled to track off to the south on the western side of the swamp. Some interesting stumps appeared, and I made a cursory inspection of these, but I was most beguiled by a brush-covered dike I saw to a short distance beyond. A dry ditch bordered the dike, and a fascinating holes and tunnels opened out from under tree roots, a most promising spot. I had no intention of coming so far, and though I had lost no time getting here, I felt the others must be growing impatient to be on their way. But then, suddenly, I had the conviction there must be something here. I hadn't far to go for long to wait, for as I walked on a few more yards, I saw an enormous diamondback coiled on the slope of the dike. The sun shone full on him, a glorious sight. It was one of the biggest I have ever seen, and one of the lightest in coloration. I tossed a bag on the ground and hooked him over to me and away from the holes which offered escape. This was an unusual diamondback. It hadn't rattled, nor did it coil in the usual defensive posture. Instead, it tried to crawl away from me like a canebrake. I do not know precisely how long I spent trying to guide it into the bag, but it seemed an eternity. At last I gave it up and hopeless, and using as little pressure as possible, I pinned the huge head, grasped the neck, dropped the hook, and seized the bulky body, expecting to have a terrific struggle, but not so. There was some resistance, but many smaller snakes have shown more fight. Nevertheless, I did get a splash of musk full in the face as I had with the canebrake, but I ignored this as a harmless gesture of defiance which I could hardly resent. Possibly this snake was sluggish from a meal it had eaten recently, a meal of rabbit, as was proved later by the unmistakable hair found in its stools. All such remains examined by us show diamondbacks to be essentially rabbit eaters. With remarkably little trouble, I got the monster into the bag and soon was on my way back. Apparently I hadn't been gone as long as I thought, for I was amazed to find that I had hardly been missed. But my friends were really astonished when they learned I had caught a diamondback in that short a time, and they gathered around to look into the bag and admire the brute. Charlie, whose luck hadn't been too good, made a caustic remark about there must be a guy back there selling them. The season was exceptionally dry and cool. even downright cold at times. The unusual extent of dry ground increased the territory to be explored, but with less benefit than if it were flooded, as much of it would be normally. In desperation, we revisited productive spots oftener than the results warranted. Our last day dawned cool and overcast, consistent with the adverse weather that had prevailed during most of our stay. The temperature during the night had dropped to 45 degrees and had only risen another 10 degrees by 8:30, and to make matters worse, a brisk wind blew from the east. We hunted all morning without seeing a snake, and in the afternoon I suggested that we return to the place where I had found the big diamondback, back there where the guy must be selling them. We drove along the woods road, to the little swamp where we had stopped before, but to our astonishment, there had been much activity here in the last 2 days. The bridges had been raised, and huge culvert pipes had been carried in to be laid in their stead. The road would pass over them once they were properly placed. A more practical, if not a picturesque, arrangement, but for the present we could drive no further, and left the car where the first bridge used to be and set out on foot to reconnoiter the entire area. I followed a wide circle, starting on the north side of the road and coming round to the west and south. Eventually met Charlie at the dike where the diamondback had been lying 2 days before. It looked more favorable than ever, but after nearly an hour of searching, we failed to turn up anything at all. Meanwhile, the sun had come out and shone quite warmly, but even this concession on the part of the weather didn't improve matters. Tired and dejected, we returned to the car, where I found an orange with which to quench my thirst. I sat in the driver's seat, with the door open and my legs hanging out, and prepared to peel my orange by first making longitudinal incisions of the skin with my pocket knife. Completing this operation, I looked up, and immediately in my line of vision was something I couldn't accept at first glance. I did what is known as a double take. Yes, I was convinced. My eyes weren't playing me any tricks. Not 15 feet from the station wagon, a diamondback was stretched out close to the side of a log, only concealed by vegetation, but unmistakably a diamondback. I dropped the orange as if it were red hot and reached for a snake hook, shouting to Charlie at the same time, but I didn't realize until some minutes later that he had slipped away again without my noticing and was nowhere about. I found a bag and hooked the rattler onto the road where I had a clear surface on which to work, and started the task of backing him into the bag, a trick which much practice had made us near perfect as possible. Charlie returned before I quite finished, and was naturally struck by the irony of having driven the car to within a few feet of this rattler, but I was remembering how nearly 20 years earlier this very thing had happened with the very first diamondback I ever saw in the wild. Too bad Pat Bilks had gone home so soon. He would have appreciated this repetition of history, and his presence would have completed the picture. We carried the rattler back to our camp at Sandy Hill, the starting point for so many snake hunting adventures, the last snake of the last day of the expedition, and the last I caught in South Carolina. But I hope, God willing, it was far from being the last I am to see at Okatee. Thanks for joining us for the reading today. But before I leave, I just have to tell you that More Than Snake Hunting, Even More Than Snake Hunting by Craig Thumbauer are a must-read So please, please get one or both of these volumes. They are so inspiring. They are truly the Carl Kauffeld books of today. They are for the new generation. Thank you so much. I'm going to go catch a bull snake.